My only regret about blocking people is I can't block them in real life.
He is actually the most viewed person on our channel.
100% of my information diet is either social media or books.
How do you then get this courage to break the norms?
How do you function in an uncertain and dangerous world?
It turns out that there are not a lot of people on Twitter who follow 20,000 accounts.
Your support network has a value system and they have things they care about, things they're interested in. And there's this concept of kind of founder dating or founder matchmaking, which is like, I want to start a company. I need to find a co-founder. I'm going to ask a bunch of people. I'm going to go on a bunch of like blind founder dates and I'm going to partner up with somebody. The pursuit of utopia just gets us to tyranny and madness and death. He should have lost both Tesla and SpaceX. He should have lost them. This is another thing we can get flagged for by YouTube.
How should you think about finding the right person to fall in love with and marry?
There's like two kinds of naivete. There's a really good kind and a really dangerous kind.
Mr. Current Thing, Marc Andreessen. Marc, welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another exciting episode with Aarthi and Sriram. And today we have back, by popular demand, a very familiar face. He is actually the most viewed person on our channel. If you go to our channel on YouTube and sort by most popular, you will see his face and his name right at the top. So we give what the crowd what they want.
Yes. Who is this person?
Well, the one, the only Mr. Formerly Current Thing. I'm not sure we say that anymore, but Mr. Current Thing, Marc Andreessen. Marc, welcome back.
There's always a current thing.
Okay, we will get to that. Now, the idea we had for doing this show was, in Spotify, when you go to an artist, say YouTube, Madonna, etc., there is this is YouTube. This is like, well, here's like, the canonical reference for this artist. And if you just listen to these 10 songs, you can, sound smart at dinner conversation. So the idea behind this is to be the canonical P-Marca content archive. Okay, but with that, I want to get going by asking you a very serious question. What did you get done this week?
Not nearly enough for Elon's satisfaction.
It's Thursday night, Marc. I have one more day to go.
Yes, I'm sure that you will let me know, and he will let me know.
Well, neither of you are shy on Twitter, to put it mildly. But maybe maybe it's an interesting question. So a lot of you, kind of heard of you, seen you, read you. What do you actually do in a typical week?
Yes. So it's a complicated grid melange of activities. I'll try to give the thumbnail sketch. So, the venture firm now is that we're a part of, Sriram and I are a part of, and Aarthi by association through marriage and friendship, is about to pass 500 people. So we've really kind of hit a level of critical mass that's kind of unusual in this business. And then we've got, Sriram, you might remember, is how many total general partners at the firm now? 20.
25. I'm going to say I should know. One of us should know the answer to this question.
One of us should know the answer to this question. So about 25 general partners, which means about 25 investors, and then across the 6 verticals that we invest in. And so there's a couple things. One is there's a lot. I have my own portfolio companies. I'm on the board of. I'm on the board of about 10 startups of different sizes, and a couple of public companies. But we have a very big portfolio. We work with a lot. We're fortunate to work with a lot of the really great founders, and so there's a lot of time just spent with the actual companies. I like to say basically my job is to kind of put my hand up and kind of scrub in with a company, whether I'm on the board or not. I scrub in kind of in 2 circumstances. One is if there's an unusual opportunity, something that's going particularly well that where you could really see something compounding and becoming incredible, or when the shit hits the fan, or as the Brits call it, when there's an omni shambles.
I would say the Brits have an interesting sense of humor. I mean, I was watching the lettuce thing today. Like those folks know how to do it.
Yeah, they actually coined the term omni shambles was coined in a famous British sitcom called The Thick of It, all about British politics, which was a worst case scenario for British politics at the time the show was made.
Which was your recommendation? We loved it.
Fantastic show, and also a great movie, by the way. There's a movie version of it too. Really highly recommended. But
that's right. But that show, just like House of Cards in the U.S., that show went from being a worst case scenario of British politics to a best case scenario of British politics.
Oh my God!
So the humor might be fading a bit. But anyway, yes, they have this wonderful word omni shambles, which basically is when everything goes wrong. And look, the nature of companies is generally either a lot of things are going right, a lot of things are going wrong. And the reason is for that is because success tends to feed on itself, right? Momentum begets momentum. And then when things go sideways, a whole bunch of things start to go wrong at the same time. And look, every company goes through these like crazy ups and downs. Like there's no big successful company that hasn't gone through plenty of crisis periods. So, so we always try to roll up our sleeves. Ben and I try to roll up our sleeves and always scrub in. So it's a lot of that. It's a lot of, and then it's, it's chasing new deals. And so, we're always on the hunt for the next big thing, and we always have deals in flight. And so, I try to help, kind of close those and get to know the founders and, help figure out, the right investments. And then what else? We spend a lot of time, kind of building what we want to be the world's best network. So when founders come work with us, the term that Ben and I use is it's like plugging into the matrix. Like you basically raise money from us. You basically get access to the world, which means you kind of get access to a lot of the sort of most important people, kind of across every sector of society and business. And so, we spend a lot of time with people outside the firm. And then, probably two other things. One is just learning. It's just extraordinary, right? How this field keeps evolving. And the things that were important 10 years ago are still important, but there are a whole new set of things that are important and they're brand new. And they're often very, very different. And it's very kind of natural human behavior at some point to stop learning. And so, we're all always trying to inject ourselves into new things. And then it's stuff like this. It's sort of outbound. We think of sort of outbound communication, PR, kind of all the work we do, videos and content and writing and so forth. It's basically it's like we have a point of view. We know what we stand for. We have a point of view. We think we have a sense of how new technology should get built, how new companies should get built, how new industries should get built, how the world should evolve. And, we like to kind of broadcast that as widely as we can. Some of that's just to get the ideas out, but a lot of that has to do with having people feel like they know us by the time they meet us. Right. Because if it's like if you have a chance to read a lot of writing that somebody has done or listen to a lot of audio, or watch a lot of video, you can really get a sense of somebody before you actually meet them for the first time. And so it turns out, I think, to be very helpful in building trust with people we're meeting for the first time. So that's the broad cross section.
Well, yeah, I want to get to the knowing people part, but I had read somewhere that you had retired, but I guess that's not true.
I have read variously that I've retired. I've read that I've moved to Miami. I have read
which is
many.
Worse? Which one is worse? Okay, we want. Yeah, I'll let you.
I think Miami is a lovely city, especially in July. Yes. Yes. No retire. Visit Miami, but haven't moved there. I was going to say very happily in California. I would say very semi-happily in California.
I sense the hesitation there with the happily.
Yeah.
Happily in California.
There's a comment in there, and we love Miami. But so I think I want to get to one of the topics. You had a recent tweet storm, which I thought was super fun and interesting, and we want to kind of maybe unpack that a little bit. One of the things which I think is really interesting about you, and I know we talked about this behind the scenes, but I think we talk about it with founders, etc., is I would say how do you and how do maybe people listening think for themselves, think independently. And what I mean by that is like Aarthi and I, grew up in India, grew up in sort of a very traditional culture, and growing up, there was a lot of pressure on us to conform. And and of course Aarthi was a crazy wild person, and I was like less crazy and wild, but there was really like a way, there was definitely like the way you thought, there were strong cultural beliefs, and we always can try to like resist that and find our own path out of that, and it's hard. And I think a lot of people watching this, right, like are trying to figure out how to escape the matrix. And I know you think a lot about beliefs, how to get out of them. So let's just start with, how should somebody think for themselves?
Let me just start by saying that was a really good Andrew Tate reference there for people who didn't catch it.
This video is going so well, and now this is going to disappear.
We just gave our editor a little bit of a job to do there. We're just noting the minutes right now.
I just want your videos to have those interesting flags on YouTube in the search results, right? Like.
Did Mark say some name? I couldn't hear it. There was some technical difficulty.
Just a bleep, 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 bleep. That's all you're going to hear.
Exactly. So let's do, I think you guys are hopefully interested. Let's do the long version of this question.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Long version of the answer, because I think this is a very important, kind of question, how to think creatively. It's something, we've all thought about a lot in our business. I've thought about a lot, and it's really complicated, right? And just start with like the default answer, which is most people don't. Right, like most people just don't think creatively. There's actually psychologists have actually this test where there's like they can actually test people's basically level of creativity, and the way they do it is there's like 15 different creative domains like art and music and writing and so forth, and software, and then there's like 7 levels of creativity ranging from like an amateur project you do in your spare time all the way to like a national award winner. And depending on how you fill out the matrix, you get your sort of creativity quotient, and most people score 0, right? Like most people just go through life not. And by the way, like many people are happy not creating, which is something we'll talk about. But a truly creative person is in any field of activity is a really rare thing. So let me come at this in a couple different layers. And so let me identify the layers up front. So there's a sort of a psychology layer. Let's call that. There's like a sociology layer, like group psychology layer. And then let's say there's a sort of a friends social network layer, which is really important, which we'll talk about. And then there's finally the kind of, what do you do? Like, how do you go about it? Like if you want to do more of it. Mm-hmm. So the psychological layer. So at the level of individual psychology, it actually turns out there's a science of sort of individual psychology that's long established over decades called psychometrics, and the sort of scientists who study this have settled in on this sort of model of human psychology at the individual level. They call it the so-called Big 5 personality traits, and I find this to be a super interesting framework for thinking about exactly this kind of question. So just to review quickly, so the Big 5 personality traits conveniently form the acronym OCEAN, OCEAN. Mm-hmm. And so the traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Mm-hmm. And then basically, for each of those, basically there's like the trait, and then there's this opposite. So open versus closed, conscientious versus not conscientious, agreeable versus disagreeable, right? Extroverted versus introverted, neurotic versus, basically like emotionally stable. And then, interestingly, at the population level, each of those traits is distributed on a bell curve. And so in any population, any of these traits, most people are somewhere in the middle. They're kind of somewhat introverted, somewhat extroverted, somewhat open, somewhat not. And then you have these outliers where, you get these people who are on the fringes of the distribution. And, when it comes to creativity, basically who those people are just, they're incredibly highly open, like for sure, like they have to have a high degree of openness, right? People who don't have a high degree of openness are not going to be creative. They're not going to want to be creative. They're not going to be happy if they're in a position where they're expected to be creative.
So when you say openness here, maybe it's worth defining what openness means, because the way I interpret it is like, openness is being open to new ideas, thoughts, experiences, willing to experiment. Like that's the picture I have in mind.
Yeah, that's right. So it's openness to new ideas, and this is a very deep-seated thing in human nature, right? And so, and this applies across many areas of life. So how do you feel about reading a new book? Right. How do you feel about reading a new book in an unfamiliar genre? How do you feel about reading a new book by an unfamiliar author? How do you feel about trying a new kind of food? How do you feel about trying, a new place to go on vacation? How do you feel about talking to somebody, right, who doesn't share a cultural background with you? And look, one of the interesting things about personality traits is there's value there's value of openness. There's value for also, by the way, sort of not openness. Like at the population level, you want some people to be like explorers. But you also want some people to like stay home, right? And like keep the fires burning and like, basically keep things stable. And so it's this very deep-seated thing. So it's really hard to be creative if you're not open. And there's a subtlety, there's a nuance in there, which is very important, which is, can a person who has sort of low openness, who tests, you can run these kind of tests on yourself. Is there somebody who scores low in sort of the openness trait? Like, can they be creative? And it's like, maybe if they really force themselves, they might be able, like if they really force themselves to like write a poem, they might be able to, but they're not going to like it, right? It's like their nervous system is not wired that way. Right. And so you kind of need to close your eyes and kind of imagine, what if you took somebody who was born to be a musician, for example, and you forced them to become an accountant, right? Or vice versa. Like, what if you took somebody who was born to be an accountant and forced them to be a musician, right? And both people would be very, very unhappy. And so anyway, this is sort of the inherent trait of creativity, openness. So we say that, that's one. Against the directly related one is agreeableness, right? So open plus agreeable equals every new idea is a great idea, right? Equals non-discriminatory. Well, it's hard to be creative if you're not discriminatory. Like one of the things that great artists have in common is they're like actually really picky and choosy over what they think the great ideas are, and they throw away a lot of their like initial attempts. And so maybe you want like high openness, you want actually high low agreeability, which means high disagreeability, right? So you kind of want that. Conscientiousness, do artists or creators or programmers or entrepreneurs have to be conscientious? Probably yes, to some extent, right? Yep. And there's a sub-trait of conscientiousness called industriousness, which basically is like inherent work ethic, right? Sort of drive to get things done. So, you probably need some of that.
So just to stop you there, because when I first heard something like consciousness, right? Like, I thought it was like morality or ethics, but these things are actually not so much judgment calls. They're more like things on a spectrum. So for example, you sometimes want, sometimes I think great founders are willing to, look for ways to circumvent a system or, try and be creative in some way. Now, you don't want them to go too far crazy and then, they wind up in an orange jumpsuit and in prison, but you do need some level of rebelliousness. So these things are not so much, I think some people listening to this might think of kind of like judgments, but they're not. I think, the idea is like people can be in any part of the
spectrum here. Yeah.
It's wiring. Like it's sort of inherent. Like one of the interesting things about these personality traits, just on the science, is that there's these tests you can take, and you can Google like Big 5 personality tests, and there's a bunch that are available for free on the web, and you can take these yourself. And basically, very interesting things. So your personality traits will tend to be very stable over your lifetime, right? And so if you take the test today, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you will get basically the same results, right? And so these are actually like stable in your system. By the way, with a nuance, which is generally over time, as people get older, their openness declines somewhat, and their conscientiousness grows somewhat. And again, if you kind of think about this from an evolutionary standpoint, that actually kind of makes sense, right? Because from a societal standpoint, right, you actually want younger people to be more adventurous, and then you want older people to be more stable, right, and more home-oriented, right?
So you're telling me that the Marc Andreessen of 20 years ago was a much crazier but much less ethical person than the one right now?
Well, I wouldn't use the word ethical. You use the word ethical. No, look, I'm far more. I'll psychoanalyze myself for a moment. Like I am much more conscientious today than I was 20 years ago. I am much, for sure, than versus 30 or 40 years ago. Like I'm able to be. It's more satisfying for me to be more disciplined today than it used to be. And then what I'm always fighting is the tendency to be less open, right? And most people as they get older, and I'm in my 50s now. Over time, on average, when you deal with people who go from their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, they become less open to new ideas. They're just less interested in learning.
But that's still like minor shifts. You're saying people fundamentally don't change.
They don't change for the most part. Like these changes are on the margin. They get somewhat less open. They get somewhat more conscientious. But like everything else, it's surprisingly stable.
Right.
Right. And so people are kind of wired the way they are. Let me pause there.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me hit one more thing that you referenced. So the way to think about conscientiousness is it's split into two what are called aspects, or kind of subtraits. And there's industriousness and there's orderliness. Right. And this is interesting because you probably know people who are like super industrious, like bursting with energy. They get a lot of stuff done, right? They're very high momentum in their kind of work ethic and performance levels, but they're very low orderliness. And so they just leave like a giant mess behind them. And you could probably think of a bunch of people like that. By the way, there are people who are like super highly orderly and not very industrious, right? And their like desk is always clean and everything is organized, and they just don't get much stuff done. And then of course there are people, it's very unfortunate, like maybe if there's a sort of there are kind of potholes in this process, and like 0% orderliness, 0% industriousness plus 0% orderliness, is somebody who basically never leaves their messy apartment. Like maybe that's not what you want, right?
Yeah, definitely people like that too.
What's ideal, like, and it's a fit for purpose, right? And so when you're talking about entrepreneurship, I think for sure you want a high degree of industriousness, right? You want Paul Graham has a term for this. He calls this founder velocity, which is basically highly industrious people. They just get a lot of stuff done. It's the what have you got done this week, right? It's that idea. So you definitely want that. And then basically, I think for founders, you need enough orderliness where they just kind of keep the wheels on.
Right.
Right. And they're just able to like maintain a continuous stream of activity and not have everything just be like sheer chaos.
Yep.
I want to bring this back to the theme of having original thinking, right?
Yeah.
And I think we're talking about the kind of the psychological traits, and I know you have thoughts on kind of the social network you hang out in. But I have a question for you, which is, you're well known, you're famous. I've heard you have a nice house now in California somewhere. And how do you, as you grow older, right, try and seek out, things which may challenge you, things which may, take you in new directions? Because one of the things I found is as people get more successful, they get more stable in their careers, the kind of people they surround themselves with, the kind of their information diet gets locked in. And part of our job, I think, is to always be seeking out the new and always be trying to seek out like what's in the front line. So how do you do it? Like, because I think it's a process, a system.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I view it as very much, I view it, part of it is just like to do the job that we do. Like I have to do it. And then part of it is like a personal preference on my part where I'm trying to stay ahead of my naturally declining openness. And so there's a bunch of things. And so one is, look, there's a big information diet component to it. Like what are your information sources? I'll just give you my version of it. Like 100% of my information diet is either social media or books. I'm on a total barbell. Like, so I either get information that's current right now, right? Or I'm reading a book that more often than not is like 50 or 100 years old. And what I try to do is basically like fuzz out everything over a day, week, month, even year time frame, and just like fuzzle that stuff out. And so it's like, it's either leading edge information or it's like basically permanent value. And so what that does is like, then my social media experience, the purpose of my time on social media as a consumer of it is basically, okay, what I want, keep me on the leading edge, show me all the new stuff, show me all the new thinking, show me all the crazy ideas, like get me exposed to all of the really creative people. And this is one of the reasons I follow 20,000 people on Twitter.
Well, let's unpack that. Okay, first of all, there's a fun story here, right? Like when I was at Twitter, and Mark's Twitter account used to break all the time. And
wait, what? Why did you say when I was at Twitter it used to break? What did you have to do with that?
Well, I was in sort of overseeing one of the teams which had this breakage, and when we dug into it, it turns out that there are not a lot of people on Twitter who follow 20,000 accounts, right? Like that is not what Twitter was designed or meant to do. So Mark would hit these incredibly weird edge cases which nobody else was running into, and he would always be grumpy about it. But okay, so let me ask you this: how do you choose? Sorry.
More people should follow 20,000 accounts. Like this is what Twitter should be designed to do. Sorry,
you can automate these tests.
We'll see. Maybe I have. Okay, I don't want to get
Enough
into
said.
it. I don't want to get into it. But how do you pick who to follow, who to unfollow, and who to block?
Yeah. So basically, my algorithm is basically I follow on a single tweet and I block on a single tweet.
Okay.
And again, this is barbell. Like there's nothing in the middle, right? It's either or. And so if I follow based on a single tweet, which is all I need to do is see one tweet from somebody where it's like, oh, that basically that's interesting, that's provocative. There's original thinking. I hadn't thought of that. That seems like somebody kind of pushing the envelope in some way. But then I also block on a single tweet. And if I see something that's like annoying or tendentious or like aggro or insulting or like, crapping on somebody I care about, like boom, gone, that's it. Kablooey.
Is there a way back from Mark block prison? I ask because I get at least once a week, somebody sends me a note asking to be, asking for like, I don't know, to get out of block jail. So is there a way back?
Yeah. So that you direct message Sriram on Twitter. And then he calls me. I
walked into that one.
And then by the way, I unblock. I almost always unblock. But then you know what happens almost every time is I unblock them and then they say something annoying and then I remember why I blocked them and then I block them again.
Yep. There was a recent incident where
back to the ocean thing. It's just that people don't change.
There was a recent case where I vouched for a person. And Mark was like, I'll reluctantly unblock this person, and it didn't work out very well. But okay.
And I gotta say, let me just add, I love blocking people. Like I really love it. Like for me, it's like the best video game ever. It's so perfect. My only regret about blocking people is I can't block them in real life.
Well, okay. I have many comments there, but I don't think I'm legally allowed to say those. But all right. So now I want to get to, because the thing about the barbell theory is there's something implied here. And I think this is you, but it's also, Chris Dixon, who runs a crypto fund for us, which is you seek out original sources, all right?
Yep.
So you always try and avoid analysis by middlemen, by, I would say, large parts of the media. And when you talk about books, you're often also trying to find books which were written in the time, often 56 years ago, or written by peers. You want to talk about that? Because I don't think that's what people think when they say books, because you read a very particular kind of book.
Yeah. So generally, what I'm looking for from books is timeless information, right? And so it's basically, it's permanent information or as close to it as you can possibly get. Mm-hmm. And then just look. The fact is, a lot of that. How do you know that a book has timeless information? Is that the book stands the test of time, right? This is where the Lindy concept is really helpful. Mm-hmm. Look, if I'm finding what often happens, I find out about a book from somebody who I think is interesting. Somebody I think is interesting. I'm following them or talking to them, and they're like, "Hey, you should read this book." Right. And if it's a book that was published like 6 months ago, I'm like, I don't know. Let's wait 20 years and see how it does. If it's a book that was written 50 years ago, I'm like, okay, like there's a reason 50 years later why somebody who's interesting is recommending it today. Right. And I find that those are often those are, and again, it's very specific, the timeless information, like the information that doesn't change. Yeah. Okay. Analysis. I have a big problem with analysis. Like a lot of people get a lot of value out of it. And I think it plays a role, but there is always this, whenever there's an intermediating layer, between the, kind of the practitioner, the person who's actually on the front line, and then the intervening analysis, like I'll just say, like, I go out of my way to try to avoid it. Like, I try to like not experience it. Like I try to actively shut it out. I'm actually quite worried about it corrupting my thought process. And by the way, like we cheat on this, right? Because we have access in the business that we're in. We have access to all these people who are actually doing the work, right? And so, I'm sure you experience this. Is like when you meet with 20 entrepreneurs in a space and they tell you everything that's going on. Right. And then you compare that to what some piece of analysis you're reading, like it's really rare, right, to find third-party analysis that represents it correctly.
I think I didn't totally understand this until I took this job. But I think with venture, one of the amazing, almost unfair things you get to do is some of the best people in the world, some of the people at the top of the fields, just come and tell you, right? Like come and tell you how the industry works, what they're doing. And, it's such an amazing job because they just show up at your doorstep or in your Zoom meeting and they just kind of explain how these things work. And they have years of experience, or they're some of the smartest people, or often both. And it's amazing because then when you read some uninformed person, you're like, oh, okay, like I actually know what the real deal is. And it's very cool. Okay. Now, books, tweets, I get that. What about social groups, right? Like who do you surround yourself? Because the reason it's interesting is also a lot of our listeners are not in Silicon Valley. They may be living all over the world, often don't have access to, maybe some of the circles that, some of us get access to. Like, how does your social environment impact you and what should people do?
Yeah, so this was my fourth topic, which you cruelly cut my
I know,
flow.
I feel like we totally lost track of like how to be a contrarian. And then you just started like going depth first as opposed to like actually tackling the topic.
I will come back. Lex Friedman and Balaji go 8 hours. Okay, so I hope Mark went to the bathroom before this because we are going to beat that record like on the show. We will go both breadth and depth first.
8 hours and 1 minute. All right, the new challenge. So, look, this is going to be the thing I was going to say. Like, look, there's a part of being creative that is individual effort, and it's individual effort to learn, and it's individual effort to try to actually create something. And then there's a big part of it that's like, what is your personal social network? Like, who are your friends? And there's an old adage that is absolutely true, which is basically any individual over time, you basically become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Right.
You zero in, you adapt. And it's a fundamental human instinct because everybody, very few people can go through life alone. You need some sort of support network. Your support network has a value system and they have things they care about and things they're interested in. And you will tend to care about and be more interested in those things. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have anybody around you who shares your interests, right, or has the same drives that you do, you'll have a very hard time sustaining it. And so, I mean, this is a very big reason if you're going to be an entrepreneur, this is a very good reason to get to a startup hub geographically, right? Now, notwithstanding remote work and all this stuff, like to be able to have a group of friends who support each other, like, let me say, actual friends, right? And so like actual friends who are like happy when good things happen to you and are like sad when bad things happen to you, like not the other way around, like real friends. And so you kind of need that. And it's just a lot easier to discover those people in a place where there are a lot of those people. if you can't geographically do that, the next best thing is to try to do that online. And one of the great things about the modern internet is in every different creative field there are whatever Facebook groups to Reddit to all these things, YouTube channels and so forth, where you can find yourself in communities, right, where you're around people like that. And so I think the internet is an increasingly good substitute for that. Either way you go about it, though, like this is really critically important.
Yeah, I mean, this is so true for us personally. Aarthi and I actually met online, as you know, right, over Yahoo Messenger. So it was purely we were anon. And I think a lot of people often ask people like me, how did I ever meet you? How did I ever kind of become a quote unquote, insider in Silicon Valley? And we actually met because of Twitter, right? I tweeted something, you didn't block me, and we started having a conversation, and then we met years later. I'm still one tweet away from getting blocked, like everyone else.
Everyone else.
But I think this is kind of what Balaji talks about in his book also, in a way, which is the internet, Twitter is such an amazing leveling ground, right? I have so many great relationships with people on Twitter. They're just anon to me. I don't know where they live. I don't know what they're, what they look like. They're just purely anon. So I think especially if folks who are watching can't get to the San Francisco Bay Area or New York or whatever, right? Twitter is amazing, right? Or GitHub or Facebook groups or Discord or whatever. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Now I want to, just on the contrarian topic, right? Like one final thing is there seems to be some level of fortitude required to think unpopular thoughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, in the sense of, when I was growing up in school, there's pressure to conform, there's pressure to fit in. And, and I think some people look at this and say, hey, look, Mark's been around, it's easy for him to be unpopular. Right? What should a young person, how does somebody go find the courage, right? How does somebody be willing to get into a little bit of trouble, maybe not get invited to the right events anymore? How does somebody resist the pressure to conform?
And again, I think back to the original question of like cultural context, right? Like, I mean, if you look at like Asian cultures, typically it's a culture of, do you feel shame? Do you feel guilt when you break the, unspoken rules of the society or of your family, of your culture? But for a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, if you're like building companies, you probably are you are breaking some rules that are like societally, not acceptable back from like India or wherever you came from. And so, particularly for like some of our subscribers, people who've like talked to us, sent us questions, in a context that is not American, how do you then get this courage to break the norms, to think for yourself, to be okay with stepping outside that boundary of norms?
Yeah. So exactly. So this is sort of the sociological layer that I was talking about. So the sociology of this, and this is jumping up from the level of individual psychology. This is now jumping up into kind of group psychology. What sociologists will tell you, and you can read all about this, and Wikipedia actually has a pretty good entry on it. Is basically there's two different types of societies, two different types of cultures along this on this topic, and it's what's called guilt-based cultures versus shame-based cultures. There's actually a third, which is fear-based culture, which is like North Korea, where it's just like if you step out of line, they kill you. So those have their own problems. Right. For most cultures in the world today, I guess the bad news is they're either guilt or shame. I guess the good news is they're either guilt or shame. Sometimes they're a blend of the two, but like they do tend to fall out as guilt-based or shame-based. Generally, stereotypically, Western cultures are guilt-based. Eastern cultures, Asian cultures are shame-based. What's the difference? Guilt-based culture, is basically if I do something wrong, like I feel terrible, like about myself, within myself, right? Like it's like Calvinism is like the extreme form of this. It's like I have just this constant gnawing guilt. Right. And in fact, actually in the West, there will be this kind of, sometimes you get in this kind of debate over whether like Protestants have like Calvinist guilt, Catholics have Catholic guilt, Jews have Jewish guilt, like, but it's all guilt. Like it's all this sort of, it's this like inwardly determined sense of unworth and failure. And that has its pros and that has its pros and cons. We'll come back to that one. The other one is shame-based culture. Again, stereotypically, generally Asian-based cultures, right? Shame-based culture is, because, as you said, it's sort of it's how you feel in the context of all of the people you feel like you have obligations to, right? And so and how are you representing all of those people? And so how are you representing your family? How are you representing your country? How are you representing society?
Right.
At whatever level that is, and there you often get in this concept of like face and gaining face and losing face, and and literally like when it goes bad, it's like shame on my family, shame on my ancestors, shame on my country, shame on my culture.
And the repercussion there is basically you get ostracized from society.
Yeah, so this is the thing, like guilty people, like, because I come from a guilt-based culture, like guilty people, you can walk around all day feeling absolutely miserable about yourself and still kind of function. Like you can still go to the store, you can still like hang out at you're miserable inside yourself, right? And actually the degenerate for founders, the degenerate version of guilt-based culture that a lot of founders go through is they feel terrible about themselves. They feel terrible about the job they're doing. They feel terrible about what's going to happen, but they can't tell anybody. Right, because they can't tell anybody because they don't want to basically let on that they have this level of kind of crippling sort of basically self-loathing, self-hatred, lack of self-confidence. Because so in a Western culture, somebody goes around and says that, everybody else is like, wow, I feel bad for you, but now I know I don't want to work with you because that, right, I don't want to join your startup because God, you feel terrible about it. Why would I feel good about it?
Yeah.
But you can kind of in the West, you can kind of put this mask on, right, and you can kind of bluff your way through it until it finally chews you up and kind of spits you out. And in the West, there are cases. I actually do know founders. I've worked with founders. That not that many, but it's happened where they have committed suicide. Right. It literally gets to the point where the guilt becomes overwhelming and they can't handle it. So that's the degenerate case of a guilt-based culture. The sort of the extreme case, not degenerate, the extreme case of a shame-based culture, Aarthi, is I think what you just described.
Right.
Which is sort of equally bad, but kind of plays out in this more kind of, I don't know what you might call it, like more social, more collective, more visible, kind of more like everybody knows, right? In a shame-based culture, everybody knows who the bad person is.
Is there maybe an undertone of, because Western cultures are often more individualistic, and Eastern cultures are, often the family or your community is sort of the predominant unit, right? And is there maybe an undertone here where, if you're individualistic, maybe it's easier for the individual to carry guilt, and if it's a community-based unit, which is the first thing that people think about, then it's easier to cast someone out and exile them.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I mean, and to your point, us coming from India, I mean, this is kind of what we constantly see, right? At least from like public actions, where you work, what you do as a profession, who you marry, which city you live in, all of these have to fit into that set of norms. There is literally a phrase in Hindi which basically translates to "What will people think?" And it's a pretty famous kind of, it's almost like used in like parodies and stuff now, because it's like, oh, you did this, what will people think? And you have to kind of fall into that, like it's almost like there's a circle and you always have to stick within that circle. You cannot step out. And kind of like what you said, we've seen people who've just harmed themselves, committed suicide, like they just could not handle the fact that they were disrespecting that unit, whether it's their family unit, society, whatever it is. How do you get over it?
Yeah, so that look, this is the tough one. Let me start by saying, look, you're gonna be running a risk either way. In either culture, you'll be running a risk, right? Because in a guilt-based culture, you're gonna be running the risk. You're gonna feel bad about yourself. In a shame-based culture, you're gonna feel like you're disgracing your family or your society. So there is risk, and there is some level of just like it's just flat out risk that you have to take on. The best book that I've read on this topic is there's this book called The Courage to be Disliked, which is this really interesting book. It's written by these two Japanese writers. One's a philosopher, and the other, I think, is a writer. It's actually written as a Socratic dialogue, which actually works well for the material. And it's very significant that it's Japanese. It's a Japanese book. It's written by Japanese authors coming from Japanese culture. But the philosopher who co-wrote it is an expert actually in two very interesting things. One is a field of psychology called Adlerian psychology, named after this psychologist Alfred Adler, who was a contemporary of Freud, who had a very different point of view than Freud. And then it turns out this philosopher is also an expert in the Greek philosophy of Stoicism. And basically Adlerian psychology is like the psychological version of Stoicism, is the way to think about it. And so kind of think, if you're familiar with Stoicism, think Marcus Aurelius, or Seneca or people like that, right? Which is sort of like, and for people who haven't heard about Stoicism, it's an ancient Greek philosophy that basically has to do with like how do you function in an uncertain and dangerous world, right, without basically having a psychological breakdown? How do you basically handle adversity? How do you continue to function in the face of adversity, including extreme adversity, right, including including deaths of family members and so forth. So anyway, so it's sort of these Adlerian psychology plus Stoicism is sort of this matched pair of concepts. And then what's interesting about that is he kind of articulates this sort of concept of it's literally about the courage to be disliked, about what it means to kind of buck society and put yourself at that level of risk. And he does it from an Eastern perspective. He does it from the perspective of Japanese culture, which is of course extremely shame based. And what's interesting about the book is it's kind of at least I read it. It's an exhortation. Like for a Japanese audience, is written as like an exhortation to become more assertive, right? And because he literally says in there, like, you need to become more assertive, you need to be more contrarian, you need to be willing to buck society, you need you need to do that. And by the way, society needs to change, right, to actually let that happen. And so it's provocative that way. And then the other thing is just super interesting about it is it was a huge hit. And so I think it sold like 3 million copies in Japan, which is huge. And then I think it sold another like 2 million copies in hardback in the rest of Asia. And so the way at least the authors tell the story is, yes, this is why we wrote it, is because kind of people need to know, right, that there's a kind of different way to do this. Like I said, none of this is a value judgment. None of this is saying that, I don't actually think shame-based cultures have a particular inhibition entrepreneurship, because I am very familiar with the problems that arise from trying to do it in a guilt-based culture, which is, it's a great way to feel terrible about yourself, right? Which is every bit as painful, and maybe sometimes more so. And so anyway, it's a good book to kind of process through this. I don't think there are easy answers on it. I think it's the old, like there's this pattern. It's like, the nail that sticks up is the one that gets pounded. There's this thing called tall poppy syndrome in some societies where, it's just literally symbolism for the tall poppy gets
the angry tweets on Twitter.
Exactly. And so look, there's just a certain kind. There's a certain kind of person who has to do this. Like they're never going to be happy if they don't. There's another kind of person who definitely should not try to do this, because it's just the load is too great, right? Like it's just simply too great to carry. And then there's people somewhere in the middle.
And I'll give you a story from the episode. We did an episode a couple of weeks ago with Palmer Luckey, founder of Oculus and now of Anduril. And Palmer, kind of famously had, wound up leaving his role at Meta. And, I think a lot of founders would have basically, when we interviewed him, we were like, a lot of founders were just kind of given up. He was obviously wealthy, he had a lot of economic resources, he might have done something which was popular, but then he goes off and then decides to go be like, well,
picks the next unpopular thing and like really digs into that, because I knew, at that time, right now it's kind of cool to work on something like Anduril. But back then, there were, we talked about it in the episode, where thousands of Google employees protesting because, the companies, Google was like thinking about working on defense projects or something. And it was really, really unpopular. So he basically went from like leaving Meta to just doing this incredibly unpopular startup where I think somebody published this piece on like, is this the most controversial startup of our time?
Yeah, and I think what struck me, and I'm not even sure Palmer internalizes how unique his mindset is, because what struck me is like so many people are just been like, well, I have, money to last me forever. I can go buy a yacht or just go live elsewhere, or buy my way back into
society,
elite society. But here he goes off and goes off into the desert, I think literally, and then builds his thing. And of course now he was proved right like many years later. But I think so there is definitely a set of people who are just wired that way.
Yeah, they have to do it. They're just going to be miserable if they don't do it. And again, this goes to basic wiring. And so go back to our big five thing. Like, what do we know about them? I mean, the big thing on this topic is they're highly disagreeable, right? They're just like, not only do they not care what other people think, like they can't even imagine trying to conform.
Yeah.
Right. And look, it's a rare thing. Like there are a lot of people who are not wired to do this. This goes to one of these things again, is like, look, somebody who's highly agreeable should probably not try to do this. They're probably going to be very, very unhappy, right? If they try to do this. Look, the other thing I would just highlight, and it's going to sound, maybe like a cliche, but it's absolutely true, which is like, you really do have to know what you're doing, and you really have to know what you're talking about, and you really have to be deep in the domain. So, and this is where the idea of being contrarian is actually, I think, maybe not that helpful, because the idea of being contrarian is like, let's just assume the conventional wisdom is wrong and try to come up with a different idea. But I think the actual real thing is, like, let's really deeply understand the topic area that we're working in, right? And so let's like really deeply understand the domain of like whatever, Web3 startups or AI or whatever it is, right? Or by the way, music or art. One of the things I found over the years is just amazing is like the great musicians are almost always just incredible historians of music. Actually, Bob Dylan actually, won the Nobel Prize for Literature based on a lot of, among other things, a lot of his writing is actually done on the history of music and therefore the history of American culture. And if you read his writings or listen to the stuff he's done over the years, like, he's just incredibly deep on the entire history of American culture.
Right.
The same is true for many other kind of top artists. They're just really, really deep in their domain. And then it's being deep in the domain that basically gives you the actual, license to be able to say, okay, this assumption that everybody has is actually the wrong assumption. And I'm not just guessing that it's the wrong assumption. I actually know it's the wrong assumption, right? And I can actually explain to myself and other people in a way that is like very clear and correct, right? That this is actually wrong and that things should work a different way. I always cite the Steve Martin, his number one, the comedian Steve Martin, his number one tip for career success, right? Which is be so good they can't ignore you, right? And here what that means is like, be so deep in the domain, be so much of an expert, like understand so much, right? That when you actually have a contrarian position, like even if people don't believe you, like you're right. Right. And then that's the foundation to be able to start to convince other people that you're right.
Yep.
Right.
By the way, I'm kind of worried that as a result of this episode, people are going to be like, well, Mark wants disagreeable people. So if I ever run into Mark in a conversation, I just need to be a total jerk, right? Like, he'll like me.
Just going to have a lot of people who are just really annoying and just disagree with you all the time.
I already kind of have that.
Then you block them.
Yeah, lots to unpack that. Okay, so I think we start talking about we start talking about founders. So maybe this is a good segue into I think a lot of people watching our show are aspiring founders or founders themselves, and they often, I think, have some very fundamental questions about company building. And you, of course, you are a multi-time founder yourself, and working with founders is what we do. Let's start with the basics, right? Let's say, how do you decide or know whether an idea for a startup is good or not, right? Like, you could be anybody. Maybe you're an engineer, you work for a few years. Maybe you're a student. Maybe you're a seasoned, exec, any range. Like, how do you actually kind of figure out what the idea maze is and when to start working on something?
Yeah. So look, the big thing, I highlight a few things. Right. So the big thing is most of the obviously good ideas are bad ideas for a startup. Right. And the reason is because most of the obviously good ideas, if they're obviously good ideas, they're already getting done by big companies. Right. And so what are big companies really good at? Like, just take all the top 50, whatever tech companies, what are they really good at? They're really good at doing the next obviously good idea. Right. They're like, what's a good idea? A smartphone whose battery lasts 10% longer. Yeah, like Apple's on it, right? They got like 10,000 people working on that, right? There's no startup opportunity there. And so, like, we always say, kind of by definition, like, if it's a good startup idea, it can't be a good idea that looks like a good idea, because a big company's already doing that. It almost always has to be a good idea that looks like a bad idea. Right. So it has to be something that is contrarian, counterintuitive, non-obvious, right? It has to be something that everybody else hasn't already figured out. It has to be important, right? It has to matter, right? The actual thing has to actually, matter in a way that anybody's gonna ever actually care about it. And then, going back to what we just talked about, like, you have to actually be correct, right? Like, most ideas that look like bad ideas actually are bad ideas, right? In fact, the overwhelming majority of ideas that look like bad ideas are in fact bad ideas. And so you have to really be deep in the domain to be able to get to the point where you can say, okay, I know this looks like a bad idea, but I know that I'm right for the following, 18 reasons. And I know that if we do this, it will be this will matter. Like, this will make a difference. People will sit up and notice. Customers will say, wow, like, I can't believe, somebody hasn't done that before. Look, the good news is the world is full of these. Like, there's this concept in physics of something called path dependency, right? So why is the world the way that it is today in any domain? It's because a lot of people who came before us basically made a lot of judgment calls and a lot of trade-offs, and it evolved a school of thought in a certain way. Like, they weren't perfect. Like, they were smart, but they weren't perfect. They probably had blind spots. They probably made mistakes along the way. They probably didn't think about things. If somebody who's deep in a domain almost always knows of things that are not quite right, right, or knows of things where if they had a chance to redesign it, they would do it differently. And so, for people who are deep enough in a domain, they have the ability to kind of ferret those things out. And then, it just so happens in tech, if you can ferret one of those things out and then build a product based on it, like that's the foundation usually for a great new startup.
Now, I know that you have a particular way of knowing when somebody is actually deep down the idea maze, and it's actually super easy to reveal because it's so hard to fake. So how do you judge whether a founder is actually deep enough down the idea maze?
Yeah, so this is the thing where we just tell everybody what we do, and then they can try to bluff us out of it. But like it basically it works even when they know what we're doing. So and it turns out it's the same technique that homicide detectives use. And so this is true. So we use the same technique to ferret out whether founders are telling us the truth, basically, and actually have a good idea, that homicide cops use to determine whether you actually killed somebody.
That's a good YouTube title, right?
Great selling point.
Well, here's what you've all seen this in movies. Actually, you probably, if you're into crime movies, at least you've probably seen this scene in movies because it'll be in the movie occasionally. Which is because what the homicide detective will do is basically they'll ask increasingly detailed questions, right? And so it's like, okay, whatever, you're whatever your friend was killed, on Thursday night. Well, where were you Thursday night? Well, I was at the movies. Okay, well, which movie theater did you go to? Okay, I was at whatever, Regal Cinema. Well, who did you go to the movie with? I was by myself. Okay, what time was the movie? Which movie did you see? Who starred in the movie? What was the opening scene of the movie? What was the climax of the movie? Right? Like, and so what happens is when people are guilty, when they're unless they're like really devious, when they're guilty of a crime, basically what happens is like they basically are making it as the questions get more and more detailed, they have to basically make up more and more details. Like most people can't anticipate all these eventualities ahead.
Right.
And by the way, that's the whole thing. Well, then what did you do after the movie? Oh, I went out to eat. Well, which restaurant? What did you order? What was the appetizer? What did you get to drink? Right? If when we interview the waiter, is he going to say that you actually got a Diet Coke and not a Diet Sprite? Right. And this is how they sweat a suspect. And basically what happens is at some point, if somebody's guilty, right, at some point, basically they break down, like they fuzz out. They can no longer give coherent answers or they give answers that can be easily disproven. Right. Because you can go check the receipt at the restaurant and like they didn't order that thing or whatever. Right. Or the receipt doesn't exist. And so we basically do the same thing. And basically, this is why we call it the idea maze. So the concept of the idea maze is to really be the master of a domain, you have to really understand all of the twists and turns that require getting from kind of point A, which is like a vague idea of what you want to do, kind of all the way to point Z on the other side of the maze, which is an actual product that matters that you can build a startup around.
Right.
And you have to actually like think your way through all those steps. And the founders who are good at what they do think through, they take the time, they put in the effort, often years, right? Like what I find is it's almost always 5 years plus. Like this is not like a short-term thing. It's almost always somebody, the great successful companies, great founders almost always have thought deeply about the domain they're operating in for 5 years, often 10 years, often longer. And if basically you ask increasingly detailed questions, if the answers get more and more specific as the questions get more and more specific, that's really good. If the answers get more and more general and more fuzz, then it's like, okay, you're and by the way, okay, you're trying to pull one on us. Okay, by the way, you're also trying to pull one on yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Like if we can shake you out in that process, like you shouldn't be doing what you're doing anyway, because you haven't done you're not prepared you haven't done the work. You don't actually know what you're doing.
No.
Is there such a thing as a founder domain fit? Like, would you say, the specific kind of founder should or should not pick a domain like this kind of thing, or is it fairly agnostic?
No, so it's often the case that there's, you found a domain fit. Sometimes we use the term founder market fit, which is as sort of a variation of product market fit. Very much. So in many cases, the success cases is the founder was basically just like born to be in the domain, right? That just is who they are. It's what they spend all of their waking time thinking about. It's the field they've worked in their entire life. It's what, our partner Chris Dixon calls it. It's what you work on nights and weekends. Like it's the thing that's just inherent. And one of the things we get to deal with is we get to deal with these very extreme people who like have this kind of obsession about all kinds of, fields of technology, including ones that you might not think would draw people who are enthusiasts, but nevertheless do. Like some people are like really deeply into accounting software, and it's just like super fantastic to have them start an accounting software company. So that's often the case. Having said that, it's not always the case. And there are founders, who have the skill set, which is a very specific skill set, and you might call it kind of the product management skill set, or kind of product management on steroids, where they're like really, really good at they have a methodology basically to X-ray a market, right? To basically categorize it in all kinds of different ways, to analyze it, to learn about it. Hewlett Packard was in its sort of inventive heyday, back in the sort of 1950s through the 1980s.
Right.
They had this sort of version of this. They called it the next desk principle, which is basically next bench. So think about old engineering labs where they have like workbenches, right, one next to the other, and like each workbench is making basically the product that the next workbench takes advantage of. And so this workbench is making the microchip. That microchip then goes to the next bench. They make the calculator. The calculator is then used to design an oscilloscope. The oscilloscope is then used to design a radio transmitter, like whatever. And so each bench is building the key input for the next bench. And so then if you're what the bench that you're at, how do you discover what product to make? You go ask the people of the next bench. And that's like a nice metaphor for basically how you do this. It's sort of the art of product management, to do this in a domain you don't understand, that you're not kind of a native in, which is you have to actually go systematically learn about it, right?
You'd be surprised and shocked. I mean, some people say, like, how often you meet some people and they would have never actually thought of even talking to a customer, or thought of talking to somebody who would actually use it. And not the thought doesn't enter their mind at all. And one question on this: how do you sort of square this with, sometimes there's a theme of maybe naivety helps a founder? Because sometimes if you've seen the 20 different ways that you can build a system and you're jaded, and when the new idea shows up, you're not open to it, as opposed to, and then you suddenly see like a 22-year-old who has no idea of the history of the space, figure out how to actually go build this. So how do you square being deep down the idea maze versus sometimes, not knowing all the 100 different ways something has failed doesn't give you maybe intellectual baggage?
Yeah. So let's start on the other side of naivete. Let's start with that first, which is cynicism. Right. So because there's a match pattern, because you see exactly what you described, and then you see the other side of it also, which is you see especially like more experienced entrepreneurs who have operated in a space before, and they become too cynical. And the reason they become too cynical is because they have gone through the process of trying to make things work in that domain, and those things have failed. And and the way human psychology works is, when you try something and it fails, the big lesson that you learn is never try that thing ever again. Right. Like, I tried to pet the saber-toothed tiger, it bit my hand off. Like, do not pet the tiger again. It's going to bite my other hand off. Right. It's like a very, very natural, this is what we call experience, right? Negative.
You have some weird hobbies. What go on?
Negative lessons. There are other things you pet these days that bite your hand off. So that's the other side. And basically what happens is, like, and there are founders that are like this, where they just flat out get too cynical. Like they're too negative. They have too much of a litany, too much of a history of basically all the things that have gone wrong. And then they basically work themselves into a state where they can't take a risk anymore, because everything just seems like it's fraught with peril. So that's the other side of it. So I would say, like, going back to naivete, I'd say there's like two kinds of naivete. There's like a really good kind and a really dangerous kind. So the dangerous kind is like, I don't know what I'm doing, and that's like a huge asset. And it's like, no, it's not. Like, no, not even a little bit. Like, you need to go learn. You need to go understand what you're doing. Like, and by the way, what do you need to learn? Like, you don't necessarily need to learn the history of like every startup that's ever tried this thing, but like, you need to go learn the domain, right? You need to be very, very, very deep in the technology and in the market, because just simply saying I'm naive and I'm a newbie and it's good because I don't have all the scar tissue. It's like, well, okay, fine, but like, what do you actually know? What actually qualifies you to make these judgment calls? The good kind of naivete basically is saying, okay, look, it doesn't matter what people tried before. And the reason it doesn't matter is because the difference in time. When former founders tried this idea 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, yeah, they failed. But, look, by the way, maybe they failed because they're just not very good, which is a possibility. Or more often, actually, they failed because, like, it's just like the world wasn't ready yet. Like the market wasn't ready yet. I'll give you an example. Right. So the iPhone, the concept of the iPhone was not new in 2007 when Apple released the iPhone. Like, the concept of the smartphone had been in existence for a long time. The first smartphones actually were built in the early 80s, right? 25 years earlier. And then there was a product that was very iPhone-like from this company called General Magic in 1993. When I actually first came to Silicon Valley, I actually went to the General Magic launch event at Fry's Electronics in Palo Alto with,
Nice.
We love that
We
store.
love Fry's. Oh man,
iconic store. It was so tragic when
they had to shut it down.
They shut down, but it was like going there was like a pilgrimage.
Yeah, and so this company, there's a documentary, this company, General Magic, and it's all these sort of Apple, kind of people who built basically the iPhone in 1993. They called it the communicator, but it's basically the iPhone, and it had email, and it had like e-commerce, and it had like all these things that you have on apps. Like it had all this stuff and chat and everything else, text, all this stuff on the thing, and it's just like, and you could use it, you could buy it, you could use it. It just didn't. The technology wasn't ready yet. Like the chips weren't fast enough. The screen wasn't high resolution enough. The networks didn't have enough bandwidth. The operating system wasn't, sophisticated enough. And, it was too big and too heavy and too thick and all all these issues because it just wasn't time yet. And so the sort of, bad form of the naivete, or the cynical thing would be, okay, that was tried and failed. And therefore let's never try that again. The bad naive version would be, look, I just have this idea for building a phone, but I actually don't know what goes into it. I'm just going to try to guess my way through it. The sort of smart naive version is like, look, I'm just not going to be burdened, whether I know about General Magic or not, I'm not going to be burdened by the scar tissue of an earlier attempt that was just at the wrong time. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what happens is when these things hit, basically, it's very rarely the first founder that tried to make something work. They're often the sixth or seventh or eighth.
Google wasn't the first search engine, for example, so many. By the way, I think some of our maybe younger listeners may not know this, but about over a decade ago, Marc here had a very popular blog, which I suspect there's been some collected version. And there's the great blog post where you talk about there is very little difference between being wrong and being early. Right, like it's almost exactly the same. So
the number one reason I experience why when smart and highly qualified founders fail, the number one reason is they're too early. It's just the time is not right yet. By the way, they're almost never too late. It's really, really rare, at least in my experience, to have a highly qualified, competent startup founder who's actually too late. And I say that because a lot of founders actually always feel like they're too late, right? Because they can kind of envision it's like, okay, this thing should exist. Oh my God, it's going to take me 2 years to build it.
Or you see another company that just sprouted up and you see competition and you immediately I've had this a couple of times where it's like, oh my God, we are dead because they're going to they're better funded. They're going to just out execute us. They're just going to run faster. We're just so late into this game.
Yep.
I actually remember the company General Magic I described actually in 1994. So we started Netscape, and they weren't, they had this communicator. It wasn't selling very many, and so they actually pivoted after we kind of became prominent. The General Magic pivoted and decided to become an internet software company, and actually announced that they were going to build a competitive web browser. And I was actually driving to work one morning, and I was listening to the news radio when that was a thing, and they sort of had this announcement on the radio, and I almost drove off the road, right? Because I'm like, oh my God, there's all these super geniuses at this company that we're going to have to compete with.
I mean, the rational thing is to feel like I just get upset. Like you feel pissed. You're like, oh, how dare they come into my space? But now, in retrospect, after been through this, and I talk to a lot of founders, you realize that all of that stuff almost never matters. Especially if you have deep domain knowledge, you really know what your customers are using the product, how they're using it. You really know what they're building, what they're looking to do, all of that. But also, if you can really out execute everybody else and just win or find a path to win, none of the competition stuff matters. And I tell this to founders all the time on just to not worry about competitors anymore.
Yeah, okay. There's an old adage in venture, which is more companies die by suicide than homicide.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
It meaning it's almost always. Sorry to bring the mood up, but it's almost. Oh, sorry. For some reason, we're talking a lot about homicide tonight.
Yeah, there's so much suicide and homicide conversation in this whole thing.
So, which is another thing we can get flagged for by YouTube on. But no, look, it's almost always something internal. It's almost always something internal. When the company fails, it's almost always something internal to the company. It's some sort of internal breakdown, or it's some sort of exogenous factor. It's very rarely head-to-head. Every once in a while, it does happen. Every once in a while, it's head-to-head competition. It's almost always something internal to the company. By the way, I think this is good. This is actually good that this is the case. It's actually helpful information to have because basically it means you have more control over your destiny than you think, right? There's almost always something that you can do to make your company better, and that's almost always the best thing to do at any given point in time.
Yep.
Right.
Okay. I have a choice of 2 questions for you, and you can choose to answer either one. The first variant of this question is: if you're thinking of starting a company, how should you think about finding a co-founder? Or the other question you could choose to answer is: how should you think about finding the right person to fall in love with and marry?
Yes, exactly. They're basically the same. They're basically the same question.
I'll say this: when I was talking to Mark a couple of weeks ago, I said, there's so much content on the internet about startups and VC and politics.
No life advice?
Yeah, there is no about how
because we've been talking about homicide the whole time.
Yeah.
Why would we have life advice here?
I want the Marc Andreessen, what do you do on the first date, right? What do you do? Anyway, that's a future episode.
Don't kill her.
Well, that's a good
large amounts of alcohol.
Yeah, okay.
Huberman will not approve.
slip the waiter a 20 ahead of time and say, whatever you do not let the wine in the glass get below a certain level.
Okay, all right. Andrew Huberman will not approve of this message. But okay, all right. Finding a co-founder or a life partner or both.
So look, it's really hard. So here's another thing. Okay, so I'll just start with the dark side. This goes to the companies dying by suicide. It's I haven't run the numbers recently, but it's half or more of even the companies that work have some sort of founder split, founder divorce. We actually use the term founder divorce because it is what it's like. And so it is actually really rare to have a sort of a coherent, founder team that survives, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
Right.
And by the way, half the time when you think they have that, it actually they hated each other the entire time and you don't find it out until years later. There was a famous moment in the tech industry where Paul Allen wrote his book, right? Paul Allen wrote his co-founder of Microsoft wrote his autobiography. It's 35 years after they started the company. He says this autobiography drops, and it literally just matter of factly tells this incredible story of Bill Gates trying to screw him out of his stock and about how he's hated Gates ever since. And literally they went for 30 years pretending they liked each other the entire time. Wow. The entire time Paul Allen's thinking, someday I'm going to write the book and I'm going to tell the truth and I'm going to nuke this and I'm going to nuke this guy.
Oh man.
So even storied, things like that, it actually turns out that they're, and look, why is that? It's okay, look, partnerships are hard. Marriages are hard. People working together against a common objective under enormous amounts of stress, right? It's very hard. One of the things about the startup experience, much like a marriage, is look, your relationship with your founder or your co-founders is going to come, you're going to come under so much stress. You're going to see the real person, right? What stress does is it strips people down. Right. And their core personality comes out, right? Because all the artifice and all the polish and all the stuff, the little acts that everybody puts on to kind of get along in the world and kind of be friendly and so forth and try to not have people, realize that they're secretly kind of assholes or deeply insecure or deeply arrogant or self-destructive.
It's true. All of this is true. It's just, you just
it all comes out.
Want to admit it that, you just think everyone's so nice.
I'm just thinking Mark has run into some really weird people.
No,
no. They are. No, look, it's everybody. Look, I'm talking about myself. Look, you get the dark version of people under stress. You just get the dark version. And, look, some people are great. For some people that's fine and it works out and it's great. And, look, sometimes you get really lucky and people actually really bond together. You get the foxhole effect where people really, develop a huge amount of trust in each other and they learn they can really rely on each other and they learn that, each of them is looking out for the other person. And that's the positive case and that's what you want. And then a lot of times you get the opposite, which is wow, this person really is not a good person to work with. And I wish I'd known that ahead of time. Anyway, I go through the long version of that.
Warning signals that you look at for companies?
Yeah, so the big thing is I think there's very little substitute for just basically time, right? A lot of it is how well do you actually know the person? Have you have you actually, and then have you seen them under stress? Do you know other people who have seen them under stress? Have you been able to go through projects together? Right. Look, a lot of times a lot of these stories are stories of college, friends from college, college classmates. Maybe they were in intense classes together and they had to do projects together and they learned to really rely on each other. And then, some of it's just time. Like there's this concept of kind of founder dating or founder matchmaking, which is like, I want to start a company. I need to find a co-founder. I'm going to ask a bunch of people. I'm going to go on a bunch of like blind founder dates, and I'm going to partner up with somebody.
Yeah.
And it's like, what do you, it'd be like, speed, it's like a speed marriage. It's the same problem, right? It's like, okay, who am I getting? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I get that all the time. Like I get people reaching out to me like, do you know a co-founder who I can go work with? And I'm like, no, that's not the way this works. Like that's just YC application has one question, which is how long have the founders known each other? Which I always thought was an interesting question, because I think to your point, time is like probably the one thing that can kind of tell you whether this is kind of a stable relationship or whether it'll make it. And even that is like not, it's not 100%, but it's the closest indicator of whether the startup, the co-founders will actually get along.
And by the way, this is another reason, again, even in the world of kind of the post-COVID world with more remote work, this is another really good reason to try to get to a hub. And the reason to get to a hub, and then specifically on top of that, get to a hub, and then actually work for a bigger company. Like I think a lot of founders actually are better off when they've worked at a bigger company first. And it's not because at a bigger company you're going to learn how to start a company. It's because you have two really things that you can get out of working at a bigger company if you're an aspiring future founder. One is you can use it as an excuse to learn the domain, right? And so you can get really deep and you can become an expert in the field. And then the other is like you can, you want to keep your eyes peeled, and you basically want to figure out, okay, who around here is like really good, right? Who does everybody else want to work with? Well, okay, I'll give you an example. So there's this thing in any company of any size, sometimes called the Matthew effect, which is like this mathematical principle that you'd think doesn't work, but it actually does work almost 100% of the time, which is basically the square root of the number of people in a company accomplish half of the output, right? And so if the company has the square root, right? And so just to run the basic numbers on that, a lot of mid-sized tech companies, are like 10,000 employees. Square root of 10,000 is 100. And so there are 100 people in that company that like do half the work, right? And it's not like the other, 99,900 do like no work. It's just they do the other half of the work. Right. And so there's always some set of people running around in any company that are like actually the aces that actually, and by the way, like everybody knows who they are. This is the other great thing is like, it doesn't really matter what job titles they have. It doesn't matter actually what level they are in the hierarchy. It's just they're the people who get stuff done, and they're the people everybody else goes to. And like that's your best case scenario. Like those are your future co-founders. Like if you can pair up with one of those and build a deep relationship and work together and really get to know each other in that context, that's, if you reverse engineer this, that's often what's happened by the time they come and see us.
Yep. Okay. Tough times and chewing glass. So, the other, I think, theme about founders is, sometimes companies don't work, or sometimes they go through long periods where things don't work. Maybe you're running out of money. Maybe, all your customers are quitting you. Maybe the graph is going down in the wrong direction. And you have been part of companies which have gone through lean stretches, like Ben talks about, some of that obviously in his book. So for people watching this where things are not going well, and this may be because they're a founder, maybe they're an exec, maybe there's a, like more, individual contributor, like how should they think about going through tough times?
Yeah. So look, the sort of culture of Silicon Valley has kind of been suffused over the last couple of decades with this idea of failing fast. And so there's just, kind of this general idea of something's not working, like there's all this opportunity cost and you should kind of punch out and do something else. And, look, there's very smart people who kind of articulate this point of view, Eric Ries most famously with the Lean Startup book and methodology. And, look, there's something to it, right? Which is like, okay, if something's not working, like, how much of your life do you want to spend pounding away at something that isn't going to work? And, a lot of companies pivot and modify their strategies along the way. And so, there's a role there. Having said that, I've seen greater success come from the opposite approach, which is basically like almost, but not quite blind stubbornness. And, this is where we use the term courage very deliberately, which is basically like, look, I am not. Yeah. So actually, it's Elon Musk had the great quote. He said, I forget what it is, but it's on. You can Google it. He said something. It was like SpaceX rockets kept blowing up or whatever. And he finally got upset, and it's like a famous email. And he says, "As with God as my witness, I am going to make this work." Failure is not an option, right? Like we are going to keep pounding away at this until we get this to work. And actually, it is the story of SpaceX. Like there's a video actually on YouTube. Here's an inspiring video to watch. There's a video on YouTube which is a compilation video of every failed SpaceX launch.
I've seen that.
Before, right before they had the first successful one, and it is rocket after rocket after rocket after rocket exploding.
Yeah. But that's actually amazing visual, because for a lot of companies, you don't have like kaboom, right? Like, you feel it's like, maybe people don't use that button or sign up, or, they don't respond to a salesperson, but like you literally see, they call it I think, what is it? A rapid unplanned disassembly, which I felt like such a polite way of saying like it just went kablooey and blew up. But it is so dramatic.
Yeah. And look, they almost lost the company. Like, who wants to invest in a company when the rockets keep blowing up? And there were points where they almost lost the company.
Even the Elon Musk biography, I remember reading this, and Sriram knows this. I usually listen to the books when I'm going on these long runs. And I was running around like San Francisco, and I think right at the point where I think the 6th or 7th launch where it actually like worked, I just had to like stop the run, and I think I just had this moment of like, holy shit, he made this. Like, I know the story obviously, but it is just, I think what people outside don't get about like Silicon Valley and Elon Musk is it is so hard to not root for this guy, right? I mean, the things, just the sheer perseverance that he can demonstrate, and just the punishment that he can take, but he will just not give up. It's just so admirable.
Yeah. He should have lost both Tesla and SpaceX. He should have lost them. They both should have gone under. They both should have gone under multiple times.
Yeah.
With, I think, basically any other founder, I think they both probably would have gone under.
Right.
And he just simply, I mean, part of it he's really smart. Part of it is he had great teams, and then part of it is he just would not quit. Right. And then, by the way, not quitting like is infectious, right? Like when you have a leader, right, with that attitude, right, at the head of the company, like that's a big deal. Right. Another, by the way, there's actually here you can draw on like military, this is, a parallel domain that has a lot of the same kinds of things. But if you read accounts of like great battles and great generals and, heroic military, accomplishments under literal fire, a lot of it is they're a leader. Right. And by the way, it doesn't even, in military terms, it's often not even the officer. It's like the NCO, it's the sergeant. And they're just like not going to let the mission fail. They're not going to leave, theyey're not going to leave people behind. They're not going to let, they're going to save people. It's just, they're going to make it happen. The Marine Corps has the sort of motto or slogan of the Marine Corps is improvise, adapt, and overcome. And it's basically just like, look, no excuses. Like something is not working. You're on a mission. You're out there trying to make something happen. And like, your boat, like, whatever, your boat breaks or like whatever happens or your gun jams or whatever it is, improvise, adapt, and overcome. Right. And get it done. Right. And if that doesn't work, improvise, adapt, and overcome again. Right. And just keep going. And so,
is there ever such a thing for a founder as like persevering too much?
Yeah, it happens. It happens. And so, the sort of extreme form of this, which you do see from time to time, is the shorthand version is it's like year 6, year 7, year 8, year 9 of something not working, right? So like the basic framework I would use is like basically any tech startup, it basically has like a 5-year kind of opportunity. And by the way, again, some people argue about that. Some people would say it's 3 or 4, but I would say like it's 5. I've seen people pull it out over a 5-year kind of period. But there's like a 5-year runway, right? And then the problem is basically beyond year 5, if there aren't tangible signs of progress and success, you just have a very hard time holding the team, right? And so what happens is morale, kind of coherence, the culture starts to go. And then literally, look, people have choices. And so your best people are able to leave and go somewhere else. And at some point, people like lose faith. Now, look, some founders will even keep going after that. So every once in a while, they'll pull it out in year 7, 8, 9, 10. By the way, you also have these kind of what I describe as the slow burn companies. Like you have some companies that just take 10, 15, 20 years to hit critical mass. They're building over a long period of time, and then it does ultimately work. Usually it's like a 5-year kind of thing. Okay. And then here would be the other side of the argument, drawing the military analogy. Sun Tzu in The Art of War, like his argument for this is he says like at some point the army has to win, right? Like armies will fight for a while. But at some point they have to start achieving victories, or again, you can't maintain the coherence. So I think that's the other side of it. But look, the fail fast thing basically says quit way before that happens, right? The fail fast thing just basically says like, look, we're just trying to like run an experiment and we're trying to cut our losses. The problem with the fail fast strategy is there are founders who spend their lives doing the fail fast strategy. The problem is it's a risk minimization framework, right? That has the effect of basically preventing success, right? Because what it basically means, taken to its limit, is you never stick to any one thing long enough to make it work. And it is a shame. There are people who do that. It is a shame to see that when they do that, because it's like, they might have been a year away or 2 years away, but they might have had a chance of greatness, and they just pulled the plug too quickly.
I think the challenge with, I think the fail fast approach is often very closely tied to the incredible rapid prototyping approach. And there's so much
the blitz scaling.
Yeah, well, no, it's more like rapid iteration, and there's so much value to rapid iteration and prototyping. But I think one of the challenges is you get stuck in a local maxima, and sometimes technology problems take years to figure out, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you look at crypto, we are about 7-8 years into Ethereum, and 14-15 years into Bitcoin, and these things take years to play out. And there is no fail fast with Bitcoin where somebody tries out, then kills it, then tries a different version. They take years to kind of bake and build community. And I think sometimes founders, when they take this advice of rapid prototyping, iteration, kill it, they get stuck in the local maxima of the idea exploration space. And sometimes you need the jump, where you need to kind of hill climb and randomize and using generic algorithm terms to kind of go totally somewhere else and take some time to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, there's also two other, I agree with all that. And then I'd say there's two other kind of dichotomies that people should think about. So one is use of data versus not, right? Data versus judgment. And so what you often see with the companies that iterate is they're iterating, and then on top of that, they're using data, right? And then again, the consequence of that is maybe the data is not actually useful for inferring actually what's actually going to be helpful to get you to success. And maybe you're actually spending too much time optimizing the short-term metrics in addition to doing short-term product revisions. And so there's this tension trade-off between, do we use data and measure how things are going, or do we use intuition and judgment? And I think an absolutist view on that is probably dangerous. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle for most people. The other is, by the way, do we talk to customers? Right. And you mentioned this earlier, there is sort of an extreme kind of point of view that some founders have, which is I'm not going to talk to customers. I'm going to, Steve Jobs wouldn't talk to customers. I'm just going to I'm going to make it up in my own head, and people are going to want it. I don't need to go talk to them ahead of time. And then look, there's a degenerate behavior in the other direction, which is people who talk to customers too much. Yeah. And they go to the customer and they ask, what product should I build? And the problem is that the customers don't know, because the customers aren't in the business of building new products.
Yeah.
So they don't know what they want. And this is actually a Steve Jobs, nobody wanted the Macintosh before they built the Macintosh. You couldn't even, they couldn't conceive of it.
I think the mistake is to treat customers as PMs. Right. And be like, hey, you prioritize this whole thing for me and tell me what I should go do. No, that's your job. That's not their job to tell you.
It's actually especially dangerous. A lot of my background was in social media, where your customers often be your loudest users, but they're not often representative of the next marginal person. Well, this is why, at Twitter, I actually sent emails saying we should ignore everything Marc says, right? Because the number of
that explains a lot right there. That explains a lot.
Well, that explains a lot, but let's not get into that, right? A lot of current events. But I want. I'm going to get in trouble over this, but okay, I'm going to get back to I think
outside of YouTube demonetization, we have a lot of other things to worry about now.
Yeah. We may need to hold this video for a while. But you said data and intuition and pick a spot in the middle. I actually want to challenge you. I think what I've seen is most companies are at one end of the spectrum, right? And let's take two companies which we are not involved with. One is say Google and Apple. Google,
I thought you were going to say Facebook, because
I was going to pick companies that we're not involved with, right?
Right.
But I think Facebook's kind of in the similar, extremely data oriented, lots of graphs, lots of metrics. Let me use it right. So when I grew up in Facebook culture, and Facebook is amazing, and kind of the reason I have my career in Silicon Valley, and they're incredibly data oriented, lots of amazing data science, etc. And then I remember going to Snap, which is incredibly intuition design based, and I remember being like, oh, I've gone from a culture where there'll be entire meetings, there'll be no words on slides. It'll be only graphs, there won't be an English word. And then I went to a culture where, also building incredible product, but there'll be no numbers, it'll be only pictures, right? And they both work, but they're both an extreme. And I think Google and Apple is another end of the extreme. So I actually think there is actually no good middle ground. And usually companies path dependent find one of the extremes.
Yeah, I don't know. Is there no good middle ground? Yeah, I don't know. Let me put it this way. Look, if you've got somebody, and there are people like this, if you've got somebody where they're just the magic product designer, then maybe you should just get out of the way and let them do their thing. most of us normal human beings, like we might be pretty good at it, but it's still like helpful to go talk to customers. It's still helpful to look at data. With the other way around, like if people only talk to customers and only look at data, you do question whether they're ever going to have any kind of breakthrough.
Right. I also think maybe one framework could be like if it is a total 0 to 1 product, then there's not a ton of data that's going to help you right off the bat, or like talk to customers, but optimizations on top of it, or like feature extension stuff that you're adding, that I think should be much more data driven. Like I think that one you have to be a little bit more disciplined about. Is it actually moving the needle? Like, why are you doing all of this? Like all the growthy optimization things, I think it's going to be really hard to do it without looking at data pretty obsessively.
Yep. By the way, one thing I would say is one of the things I've kind of learned from last year and a half here is that things which often look weird but seem to be working, we want to pay attention to. That's because there's something there. Things which seem almost too obvious, they often work out, and there's like probably a great business there. But I often find that if pattern matching on companies which have really worked well and things I've seen working, if something seems weird and is working, there is something that maybe it's not that company, maybe it's not that founder, but there is something there that is worth paying attention to. So, for example, I would, let's use the example outside crypto. Like, if you look at, say, a lot of the AI stuff coming about, like, the early days of prompt engineering was just kind of like weird but interesting, and a lot of interesting people. Or with crypto, you had like all these interesting artists doing things which look different than anything first. But okay, all right, I want to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about books. So let me quickly share screen.
Ooh, fancy functionality.
We have fancy new software over here. Prepare to be blown away.
It's called share screen.
All right. Okay. So a couple of weeks ago, you wrote a tweet thread, which I think everyone should go and read. And in there, you had a bunch of book recommendations, right? By the way, there was some criticism of why there are so many books. It's too hard to read those, blah, 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 right? Like,
Also, what did you mean when you actually recommended a specific book? What does it say about you?
Too hard.
All of those.
Yeah. What could just made it like 2 books or something. But anyway, so I want to actually maybe, go through, we don't need the screen. We can just look at Mark. Okay. I'm going to go to 3 books, which I know you're a big fan of, right? And I want to maybe talk about like why you looked at 3 books. Okay, so let's start with Ancient City.
Yeah. The Ancient City. So the Ancient City is a fascinating book. So it's an old book. It was written in the 1860s by, at the time, a top professor at the Sorbonne and in France. This guy was an expert on the Greeks and the Romans. And by expert, I mean he apparently knew everything. He was like some sort of savant. This book is basically it's exhaustively footnoted and has citations all over the place, and they're all of the citations are to original Greek and Roman sources. And so it's like this guy like mainlined apparently like everything the Greeks and Romans ever wrote and like synthesized it. And what he was looking for, what he describes in the book, is what he's looking for is he was trying to use Greek and Roman original sources to try to reconstruct what society was like before the Greeks and Romans. Right, because we have like extensive like written documentation for how Greek society worked and how Roman society worked. We do not have extensive documentation for how pre-Greek and Roman societies worked. Right. And in the sort of history of it, this is sort of the Indo-European societies that basically predated the Greeks and the Romans. And this is like basically societies before 4,000 years ago would be the way to think about this. He basically what he said was, look, the Greeks and the Romans like had memories of this, like they came out of this earlier culture. This early Indo-European culture, and then they basically, he said, my theory is they preserve these memories in the forms of their literature, right? Because in describing their own societies, they were also describing societies they came out of, and so he kind of abstracted out of that, right, what was sort of the original structure of society, and it's specifically Western society. I don't actually know. I don't know enough about Eastern societies to know if the same applies to Eastern societies, but it's sort of the core basis of the original Western society, Western culture, and that's why the title of the book is called The Ancient City. Right, because the city was like the peak form of political and social organizing at that time. Anyway, TLDR, the original society was best thought of in modern terms as a fascist communist cult. And so take the strongest possible form of fascism you can imagine, couple it with the strongest possible form of communism you can imagine, and then wrap it in the strongest possible religious cult that you can imagine. And that was the original form of society. So as we go through these just quickly in sequence. So the fascist aspect of it was like just like no concept of individual rights. Like
Right.
even the Greeks didn't have a concept of individual rights. Even the Romans basically didn't. That emerged much later.
Mhm.
But in the ancient city, there was no concept of individual. The individual had no rights.
Mhm.
And by the way, the head of the household had complete life or death authority over the entire household. The head of the tribe had complete life or death authority over the tribe, and the head of the city had complete life or death authority over over everybody in the city. So like extremely like fascist, dictatorial. Communist, like they didn't have market economies, they didn't have all the stuff that whatever, and so basically, and these were all small, all the political units were small, families, tribes, or cities, they were all small. And so basically they all had communist economics, right? Which was a big problem, by the way, because they had all the problems that result from a communist economic system, but it's all they knew how to do. And then cult, which is they were literally religious cults. And every family had its own cult with its own gods. Every tribe had its own cult with its own gods. Every city had its own cult with its own gods. And they were serious about the gods. And in fact, what would actually end up happening was if you were in one city and you encountered somebody from another city, you had a moral obligation to kill them on sight. Because they represented enemy gods. And so your god demanded of you that you kill the representative of the enemy god, like at that kind of deep level of kind of primal drive of this destruction of the other. And so it's like, okay, it's like that's like a level of intensity.
Sounds a lot like Twitter today.
So this is the breakthrough that I had. This is the kind of conceptual breakthrough that I had reading this book, because basically the way that we're all taught how society evolved is that it like used to be super crude and like barbarous and primitive, and then over time it's gotten basically better and better and more perfect and more figured out and more clear and more powerful, and like we could build much bigger societies, and we introduced all these rights and sort of all these things. And so kind of the story we get told is this concept of Whig history, which is basically this concept of like we've been arcing towards greater and greater levels of sophistication and perfection and morality over time. Then there's something to that, like that. That's a very a lot of people believe that for good and valid reasons. But there is another way of interpreting what's happened, which is the opposite interpretation, which is the ancient city was like super strong. It was like incredibly intense in every possible way that it could be intense. And basically, ever since then, we've been diluting. Right. Basically what's been happening is we've been taking those original forms of social formation, political structure, and we've been diluting, we've been progressively weakening them over time. We've been taking what used to be all these strong bonds, and we've been turning them into weak bonds. We've been taking all these very strict, organizing principles and kind of blowing them up. We used to have these incredibly, and again, think about a religion so intense that if you meet somebody from the other religion, you feel morally obligated to kill them, as compared to how we think about religion today, which is like, wow, it's Sunday, it's time to go to church, right? Like our experience of religion today is like a billionth of the level of intensity of how they experienced it, right?
Right.
And so we today, through that perspective, and then the question to ask, right, is, if they were judging us, what would they think, right? And of course, the answer is they would think we've completely lost our minds, right? They would not even believe that we think that we can function in a society with the weak ties and the weak religions and the weak forms of social structure that we have today. And by the way, like when we judge them or we right, or when they judge us or we right, like maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle, but maybe the world's not actually on an arc towards continuous improvement. Maybe there were actually valuable things in how societies used to be structured. And maybe we should at least understand where we came from when we try to figure out where we're going.
Okay, I think this also ties in the theme of kind of reading history from and also maybe written like over 100 years ago. Okay, book 2.
But by the way, if I could,
yes,
cults, like they're still all around us.
Yeah,
go on.
That's true.
Well, every religion is a diluted, diluted, diluted. Every religion that we have today is a diluted form of a cult. Every country that we have is a diluted form of a cult, right? We have national myths. We have national, sort of concept of civic religion, national belief system, political myths. Every company is a cult, right? Every company is basically if you teleported somebody from 4,000 years ago to today, and you took them to Apple and you said, "What do you see?" and they would say, "Well, it's a cult." Like, there's the cult leader.
So I don't think using the word cult in necessarily a negative form. There's something about myth making
and conformity,
and kind of bringing people together around a cause, where you can draw a straight line from, say, a very active Discord server or what a popular YouTube influencer is able to do with their audience, all the way to something a few thousand years ago.
Yeah. In the language of the ancient city, these are all cults. Like these are all cults.
Right.
Like the modern use of the word cult is we have this very micro definition of cult, which is like whatever a sort of basically what does cult mean in kind of modern parlance? It's like a fake new religion, right? As compared to the all presumably real old.
Let me ask you a spicy question. If Marc Andreessen was starting a cult, what would that cult have to do and believe in?
Don't you? I mean, you already have the answer. You're in it.
Mark, I just thought you were going to say my religion will require sacrifice.
Of course, Of course, all religions require sacrifice.
Someday our daughter has to, be taken away from us, right? Like that's the deal.
Wow.
We have the we have the diluted form. My version, my cult is a very diluted form of what my predecessor 4,000 years ago would have had.
Yeah, she only has to listen to Mark's podcast. But
appropriately so.
There we go. Okay. Book two. The Machiavellians by Burnham.
Yeah. So actually, there's two books by Burnham I referenced. The Machiavellians is actually stronger on it's very good on politics, political theory, political structure, sort of political power, and I'm happy to talk about that. The other book, the Managerial Revolution, is actually even more relevant, I think, to kind of the kind of world that we live in, and maybe I could touch on that one if that's okay. Yeah. So the Managerial Revolution, basically so Burnham was this very interesting character where he was actually a very hardcore communist at one point. And he actually was he was an American sort of activist and leader in the American sort of Communist Party. And he was such a communist that he was a personal friend and colleague and coworker of Leon Trotsky, right? Which is like how you've known you've made it as a communist in the 1920s is like you're hanging out with Trotsky.
Yeah.
And so he was like a super communist. And then he actually broke from communism in the like 30s and 40s and got in a big fight with Trotsky, got out the other side. He ultimately later on, he became very right-wing in his later years. But the Managerial Revolution is kind of written kind of right at the turning point where he was in the process of going from communism to kind of from the far left to kind of the right. So he was kind of rethinking a lot of things. And of course 1940 was also this really kind of critical moment in kind of world history, which is it was when like World War II kind of got fully engaged. And at that time, it was, there was this battle basically of these three political systems, the three cults, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our three cults of that era, right? And they were fascism, right? Communism, and then the sort of the one that sort of flowed from kind of the Judeo-Christian kind of tilt in the culture, which is liberal democracy, right? And so World War II was kind of this three-way battle that then and then ultimately we teamed with the communists, we defeated the fascists. Then other things happened, but like this was a very live kind of question of like, okay, how are these systems? And this was on the heels of the Great Depression, right? And so there was a very widespread belief throughout much of the world that like capitalism had failed, and therefore liberal democracy had failed, and that's why a lot of people, including a lot of people in the West, had bought into either fascism or communism. So anyway, so he was in this swirl when these were like very, very live topics. And then he did this very interesting thing, which is he actually abstracted all three of those systems and said they actually all have something really important in common, which is they're all what he called managerial in nature. And what managerial meant basically was all three societies were basically predicated on the idea that basically that these societies were going to be very large and very complex, right? Like quite literally operating on like national and global scales. And that there was basically in all three kinds of societies, there was basically the emergence of basically an elite leadership class. Right, that were not necessarily like the owners of the property, right? Not like an old aristocracy where they just own all the land. It's not like having a king, right, of a small kingdom. It's not like even having a priest who's like in charge of religion. It's something else, right? It's like the commissars of the Soviet Union. It's like the Nazi high command that kind of controls all society. And then in a liberal democracy, it's the government, right? And so it's the political leaders, the House of Representatives, the Senate. And then he actually looked at companies also, and he said, look, the same thing's happening with companies, which is basically there was an old model of capitalism that he called bourgeois capitalism, which basically was like, think like the Henry Ford model of capitalism, right? Where like Henry Ford starts a car company, names it after himself, owns the car company, controls the car company, like makes all the decisions. And then, Burnham said there's also this new form of capitalism he called managerial capitalism, which basically says, the founder either was not capable of scaling the company or the founder's gone. And now the company's run by this professional management class, right? And by the way, and we know these people today, right? These are people who go to business school. These are,
VPs of product and, VPs of product at companies we know.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and so basically what Burnham said is everybody thinks that this is like a fight between fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. And he said it is like that. That is what's happening. But he said no matter which of these win, the result is going to be a managerial society. It's going to be a society that's run by an elite class of professional managers. And that elite class of professional managers is going to be disintermediated from the actual population. Like they're going to hold themselves above the population. They're going to think that they know best, even when they don't. They're going to have a new kind of educational background with things like business schools, or by the way, schools of government, right? They're the Kennedy School at Georgetown like trains people to basically run societies, and they're going to have these technical skills, these management skills, where they're going to know how to administer these large organizations and these large societies in ways that basically people who don't have those skills are not going to be able to do. And so kings are going to go away, and religious leaders are going to go away, and by the way, entrepreneurs are going to go away, right? There's no more role for Henry Ford. There's no more role for Thomas Edison. There's no more role for, instead it's going to be basically everything's going to be large scale. Everything's going to be mass manufacturing. Everything's going to be mass media. It's going to be mass politics. It's going to be mass religion. And then you're going to have this managerial class that's going to run all these mass systems. And he basically said, like, that's our future. He said, basically, there's a really big downside to it, which is like, are these people actually going to represent the best interests of the people that they're managing? Because like once they're in charge, it's going to be really hard to get them out. But he said, look, there's an inevitability to it, which is like the world has gotten too big. And at countries at the scale they're going to be at, or companies that are going to be at the scale at, you're going to need this management class. I go through all this to basically say this then is the lens that I now provide basically for what we do in venture capital, what we do in startups, which basically the way to think about it is the big companies like the Fortune 500 and the big tech companies are in this new model of managerial capitalism. And to your point, Sriram, it's like you can very clearly see that because you just like you read the executive biographies and it's like, and you see it. It's like, Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, it's like all the, Obama administration, it's all the markers of people who have kind of been in this elite management kind of role. And now they're running these companies. What we do is we fund the throwbacks, right? And Elon Musk, again, we'll just use Elon as an example. Elon's the throwback. Elon's the throwback to Henry Ford. He is a throwback to the prior era of what Burnham called bourgeois capitalism, which is basically owner, proprietor, right, dictator, right, of the company. And so basically, and why do we do this? It's because companies that are run in the managerial mode don't do new things. Right? Why do they not do new things? Because managers don't do new things. Like the whole point of being a manager is that you don't expose yourself to the kind of risk that's involved in doing new things. You just like try to basically stay in that control job for as long as possible. I think the world needs the bourgeois capitalist model, and they need the entrepreneurs to actually do what they do for anything new to happen. And so we basically keep basically the original form of capitalism alive.
Yeah. So a couple of reactions. One, I think Burnham actually says in his book is that the managerial class is interested almost solely or dominantly by the preservation of themselves, right? And I think so. That's kind of one of the reasons. But maybe sometimes when people read this or listen to this, and they look around, at the LinkedIn profile, and they're like, well, I am one of them, right? Yes. So I guess, how should right? Like,
how do you live with yourself?
I was
I mean,
we're getting deep here, right? Like,
you're just very politely asking that question, but yes.
I guess, if you are not Elon, if you're not a founder, what should you take away from this?
Yeah, well, so so first of all, there are 3 members of the managerial elite on this video, right? So like we are this, right? And if you read, by the way, you want to read these books together, because if you read the Machiavellians, what you'll learn is politically, structurally, what this is it's an oligarchy. And so we are members in good standing in the sort of modern kind of Western oligarchy. And yeah, the oligarchies have this character that Burnham describes in actually both books. He describes just oligarchies fundamentally, like by default, are out for themselves. Like they're out for their own power, they're out for their own status, they're out for their own interests. By the way, like everybody, right? It just so happens that in a managerial society they're in charge, and so they have this kind of extreme level of potential for abuse of their power and of their positions. And so look, I mean, first of all, it's just I would say the thing about Burnham is he's clinical in describing the sort of state of the world, and so he doesn't his books are actually kind of bracing to read because he doesn't spare anybody's feelings. He just kind of flat out says, here's how it is. And I like that. Like, it's just like, okay, like first let's just get the facts on the table. Like what, how does this whole thing work? Why are things the way that they are? And then, you know, by the way, like who am I in this formula? Like is an interesting thing. And then look, I just think like it's good. Like, okay, having known that, you know, it's like, okay, now we have a framework to be able to think about the choices that we make, right? And so the most obvious form of the choice is, you know, if you're somebody who has come up through this kind of managerial system, which a lot of people have, like, you know, look, I don't have the whatever Harvard, you know, business degree, but I've got a, you know, degree, you know, I've got a technical degree from a really good research university that, you know, that is a technical managerial certification, right? You know, that puts me in that class. And so, but then it's like, okay, but now I have choices, right? And, you know, maybe the most base level choice is, you know, for in our world, it's like, okay, do I want to be on the side of basically the Navy, right? The large incumbents, right? The managerial, right, companies, right? And where you know, look, I could go to you know, you guys have worked at these companies. You could go to work for these companies. You could spend your whole life at these companies. You could make a lot of money. You could probably do a little bit of good while you're there. You could probably do some interesting work, but like you're in the Navy, right? And you're sort of perpetuating the sort of status quo system. Or you can kind of say, look, I'm going to like, you know, I'm going to fly the pirate flag. I'm going to tilt towards the bourgeois capitalist model. And I'm going to go to work for, you know, I'm not going to work for a professional manager XYZ. I'm going to go to work for Elon or whoever the equivalent is. Or I'm going to go actually start a company and actually be a bourgeois capitalist entrepreneur.
Yeah. But I just say, you know, be a pirate is a much better tagline than be a bourgeois capitalist, right? Like if you want to motivate people. Okay. All right. Okay. Last book, right? And you can pick anyone by this author, Vision of the Anointed by Sowell. Oh, yeah. So Sowell, really.
Yeah. So this is a really good book. This is a really good book for kind of thinking about it's sort of like how political beliefs evolve. And it actually fits really well with Burnham. They kind of think in similar ways. So there's a series that he wrote a series of books on this topic, but the core book that's worth reading is called A Conflict of Visions. And basically what he says is it's like, why do you have like, you know, sort of modern, like left-wing political beliefs, right-wing political beliefs? Like what sort of underneath all this, what motivates all this? And sort of his model, which I think is a very good model, is basically there's sort of two different kinds of political vision that somebody can have. And the terms that he uses are a constrained vision or an unconstrained vision. And so let's take the unconstrained vision first. So the unconstrained vision is we can completely like reform, like reconstitute society, right? And so the extreme form, right, of an unconstrained vision is like communism, right? It's just like, you know, Marxism. We can literally create a new world with a new man, right, who has like a completely different belief system with a completely different set of behaviors. You know, fascism had its own version of that. We can create a new kind of, you know, German or a new kind of Italian or whatever. You know, we can sort of reformulate human nature, right? Human nature as it exists today is just like unacceptably bad in whatever sets of ways. People behave in all these degenerate ways. They're destructive to society. And so we're going to reform society and we're going to reshape humanity kind of in that process. And so he calls that it's sort of like the unconstrained vision is sort of the utopian vision. Like there's a utopia on the other side of the political project. We just have to keep fighting until we get there. The other axis is what he calls the constrained vision. And the constrained vision basically starts with, you know, human beings are imperfect. The world is messy. And attempts to accomplish sweeping social change often end up backfiring horribly. And so you say you want a communist utopia, what you get is, you know, Stalinist Soviet Union with like, you know, 50 million people dead.
By the way, one great book also is Seeing Like a State, which basically has like a great list of like every, I would say, but it's slight tangent. One of the big lessons I think I picked up from Mark, and not to flatter Mark too much, is it's often not the intent that matters. Actually, it's never the intent that matters. It's always the outcome. And Seeing Like a State is actually another great book where these people start out with the best of intents, and it's almost always like terrible outcomes.
Yeah, right. So what Thomas Sowell would say is right. The people with the unconstrained vision are focused on intent, and they're often just like flat out simply wrong about the outcomes. But frankly, they actually don't care. Right. And it's like, I'll just give you an example. Like there are a whole bunch of countries. I won't name. There's a whole bunch of countries right now that are putting Marxist governments back into power. Like right now. right? And it's like, okay, and this is the classic thing. It's like, okay, Marxism has been tried and led to disaster like 80 times. Let's try it for the 81st time, right? Like clearly you're dealing with people who have like quote unquote good intent and then very little regard for the positive consequences. That's very common for people with the unconstrained vision. People with the constrained vision, they're like, look, no, like the intention is like, no, that's not the thing. It's like what actually happens. And what actually happens is we don't get to utopia, right? The pursuit of utopia just gets us to tyranny and madness and death. We're not going to do that, right? The outcome matters too much. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to constrain our goals. And instead of trying to reform society, we're going to try to make it maybe a little bit better a step at a time, right? And of course, what happens is people with the unconstrained vision look at people with the constrained vision. They're like, my God, how can you not want to like fix all these problems and like make the perfect society? And people with the constrained vision look at people with the unconstrained vision and say, oh my God, you're a menace. You're going to destroy everything, right? You and your crazy utopian dreams are going to create hell on earth, right? And you're going to be Stalin or Mao Zedong or Pol Pot or, Adolf Hitler and all these people that kind of actually tried this kind of, social reengineering. And so anyway, what he says is, look, these are like two different kinds of people. Right. It's like the kind of person with the, we all know people like this. The person with the unconstrained vision is just like their eyes are on fire with the idea of a fundamentally better and different world. And the people with a constrained vision are like, are much more like cynical, right, about human nature, and much more like, it's there's the famous metaphor. Chesterton kind of talked about this, and there's the metaphor of the Chesterton's fence, right? He talked about, which is like, okay, you're walking through the woods and you see a fence, and you're like, wow, that fence is ugly. I think I should tear it down. And it's like, okay, wait, stop. Like, question number one, why is there a fence here, right? Like, what is being kept in or out? And right, and you really better know like why that fence is there before you decide to tear it down. And by the way, the decision to tear it down might be the right decision, but like you better know ahead of time, right? Or whatever, the Jurassic Park T-Rex, that they've been working on, mutating on the other side of the fence is going to come, eat you. So it's the people with the constrained vision are like much more cautious about these kinds of sweeping social agendas, social programs. And then basically in Vision of the Anointed, he then takes that framework and he says, we happen to be ruled predominantly in the West. We are ruled by this, what Burnham would call the oligarchy, this sort of elite oligarchy. And they are basically consumed with these utopian dreams. And they are, as a consequence, extraordinarily dangerous. This is why he calls it Vision of the Anointed. So so Sowell's term for the sort of what Burnham calls the oligarchy, Sowell's term is the anointed, and he's using that term kind of tongue in cheek, right? It's anointed. It's like, okay, anointed by whom to do what? Well, anointed by themselves, right, to make decisions on behalf of everybody else. And so that second book is Vision of the Anointed, and it's just a scathing indictment of the kinds of people who basically embark on these big social engineering projects and then end up basically causing huge wreckage in the process.
I just say
not that should sound familiar in this day and age.
I would say that those three books, Ancient City, anything by Burnham, anything by Sowell, I think if you read that, I think you're kind of like down the road of understanding where Marx stands on a lot of issues. But there's another question which you often get, and I'm going to try and answer it for you, which is how do I get Mark's attention? And the answer, I think, is write a fantastic tweet.
Well, the big answer is be so good I can't ignore you.
Yeah.
Right. And
Twitter,
on Twitter, right. Write a tweet.
Well, that'll just get him to be unblocked.
Follow in the first place.
Well, sure. Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, okay, this was amazing. One final question. I'm going to let you go. Star Wars Andor. What do you think?
Oh, it's fantastic. It's outstanding. It's fantastic. No, it's like a best case. It's like a best case. Yeah, I mean, like it's this guy. There's this genius. Tony Gilroy, and he's probably best known for the movie Michael Clayton. But he has worked on and he's been kind of a script doctor and kind of behind the scenes guy on a very large number of the great movies of like the last 20 years. They basically, and he was basically, if you saw the movie Rogue One, which a lot of people think is like the best Star Wars movie since the original couple movies.
A mutual friend of ours, I wouldn't say who, said he liked the movie because people die.
Well, so a lot of this was according to the stories. A lot of this was this guy Tony Gilroy. So there were other people that like started making the movie, and then basically the story goes is that Tony Gilroy kind of finished the movie. And look, it's the thing. Like any any serious telling, right? It's funny, right? Because it's like Star Wars, but it's like, okay, where's the war? Like where's the war story, right? Like where's there's a genre of war story, right? And there are many great war stories, war movies, whatever. And like in war, people die, right? Like and so right. Whereas if it's like a fantasy, it's like everybody gets lives and gets medals in the end. In a real war, people die, and so it's Rogue One was like the first actual war movie of that kind of set in that universe. And so anyway, so the story goes, Gilroy kind of came in and fixed the movie, and redid the ending, and then they did this incredible thing they do in Hollywood from time to time, is they kind of picked a super genius and they put him in charge and let him run. And no, I mean it's legitimately, and it's fascinating also because it's like he's doing. I think I know what he's doing. I mean, we're only halfway through it, so I have high hopes for the rest of it. Like, I think he may be doing some very special things in where the story's going.
All right.
So I
all right. I think Mark is not a fan of a lot of the recent popular fare. I won't name them, but this particular one, I was very surprised that you liked it. All right, there we go. Okay, so we didn't go 7 hours, but I think in this,
we just crossed 2.
We in 2 hours, and we covered everything from Sowell to Burnham to founder fundraising to my favorite, Mark's advice on what to do on a first date, which we definitely do. But Mark, always a pleasure. And to everyone watching this, remember, you're just one tweet away from either getting followed or being forever blocked. So with that thought, thank you, everyone. This is amazing. Thanks, Mark.
Right, we'll see you guys.
Subscribe to the YouTube channel, The Good Time Show by Aarthi and Sriram.